After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was only one of thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabited its galaxy. But these were not the stories that I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers, inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to that saga. George Lucas, from the introduction of A Splinters of the Mind's Eye, 1996. Welcome back to the Skywalker Files from a certain point of view. I'm your host, Rockwell, and today we're stepping away from the dark laboratories, mad scientists, and high-speed pursuits, and into something far more dangerous. Politics. In this episode, the chase for Jenna Zan Arbor and Granta Omega is abruptly put on hold. Not because the Jedi have failed, but because the Republic itself is beginning to turn against them. Anti-Jedi sentiment is rising, senators are whispering about overreach and accountability, and somewhere in the background, a quiet conspiracy is taking shape. Along the way, we'll explore how Obi-Wan Kenobi navigates a crisis that can't be solved with the Force, how Anakin begins to admire decisiveness over deliberation, and how the Jedi manage to save the day without actually fixing anything. So, if you ever wondered how the Republic started to rot from the inside, how the Jedi has slowly lost the political high ground, and why trusting a charming politician might be a terrible idea, then you're in exactly the right place. Before we dive into Coruscant's endless committee meetings and barely concealed conspiracies, let's take a moment to situate the story properly, because context, as the Jedi would tell you, is everything. The book we're covering today is the 9th installment in a 10-book series, placing it in a very particular and very uncomfortable position. We are near the end of the journey where the larger arcs are tightening, the long-term consequences are becoming unavoidable, and the characters are no longer allowed the luxury of ignorance. By this point, the Republic is wobbling, and the Jedi are stretched thin. And certain future tragedies are no longer theoretical. They're just waiting for the right moment. Chronologically, this story sits firmly in the pre-Attack of the Clones era, during that uneasy calm, where the galaxy insists it's at peace, while quietly preparing for everything to fall apart. The Clone Wars haven't begun, but the fault lines are already visible, especially on Coruscant, where political maneuvering is doing far more damage than any open conflict could. This installment is written by Jude Watson, a name that should be very familiar if you've been following along with the Skywalker Files. Watson is one of the architects of this era of Star Wars storytelling, particularly when it comes to Obi-Wan and Anakin's early relationship. Her strength has always been in exploring the emotional and ethical gray areas of the Jedi Order, how good intentions collide with flawed systems, and how young Jedi absorb lessons whether they're meant to or not. By the time we reach Book 9, Watson is writing with confidence and purpose. She knows where these characters are headed, and she no longer interested in pretending otherwise. The story reflects that maturity, less adventure for adventure's sake, more political tension, moral compromise, and quiet character moments that linger longer than any action sequence. As the penultimate entry in the series, this book isn't about delivering a clean resolution. It's about pressure. About watching the Republic strain under its own weight. About seeing Anakin Skywalker stand just a little too close to Palpatine than he probably should. And about Obi-Wan Kenobi doing what he does best, holding the line even as the ground beneath him begins to give way. At the heart of the story, as ever, is Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jedi Knight who has somehow become both a moral compass and a political damage control specialist. Obi-Wan is thoughtful, cautious, and painfully aware of how fragile the Jedi's position within the Republic has become. He understands that this conflict can't be solved by drawing a lightsaber, and that restraint, however frustrating, is often the only viable option. It's a role he accepts with quiet resignation, even as the ground shifts beneath the order he's sworn to serve. Then there's Anakin Skywalker, who is watching all of this very closely. Anakin is brilliant, impulsive, and increasingly impatient with systems that move slowly or refuse to act at all. In this story, he's less concerned with the political nuance and more interested in results. That mindset makes him effective during the crisis, but it also draws him towards someone who embodies decisiveness in its purest form, Chancellor Palpatine. Anakin doesn't just respect Palpatine, he learns from him, and that, more than any blaster fire or seeker droid, is what makes this installment quietly unsettling. Siri Tachi continues to serve as a steady, grounded presence. She's capable, perceptive, and often the unspoken counterweight to Anakin's volatility. Siri understands the cost of Jedi restraint and carries it without complaint, offering support where she can and clearly offering clarity where others might rush ahead. Her role here reinforces the idea that the Jedi Order still produces thoughtful, disciplined knights, even in a galaxy no longer seeming interested in listening to them. Ferus Olin, meanwhile, remains one of the more fascinating figures in this era. Still young, still uncertain, Ferus is observant in ways others aren't. He notices patterns, connections, and perhaps more importantly, what isn't being said. In this story, he functions both as participant and witness, absorbing the contradictions of the Jedi Order and the Republic with a clarity that suggests these lessons will not be easy to forget. On the political side, we have Chancellor Palpatine, who never raises his voice and never wastes a move. Palpatine's brilliance here lies not overtly in villainy, but in calm, calculated leadership. He solves problems by redefining them, neutralizing enemies by elevating them, and constantly positions himself as the only adult in the room. Anakin notices. Obi-Wan notices too, but understands the danger in a way Anakin can't. Bog Dividend and Senator Sano Sorrow serve as reminders that not all threats are masterminds. Bog is small, bitter, and desperate to matter, while Sano, cloaks ambition in the language of reform. Together, they represent the kind of opportunistic power grab that thrives in moments of public distrust. They're not particularly clever, but they don't need to be. The system is already cracked. Finally, there's Astri Odo, the quiet but crucial figure. Not a Jedi, not a politician, just someone who recognizes when a line is about to be crossed. Her courage in coming forward and her concern for her son, Loon, anchors the story emotionally. In a narrative full of power plays and ideological battles, Astri reminds us who actually pays the price when those games go wrong. Taken together, these characters form a study in contrast, patience versus urgency, principle versus effectiveness, and restraint versus control. And standing slightly off-center, smiling politely as always, is Palpatine. Watching them all make choices that will echo far beyond this book. The story opens not with momentum, but with interruption. The hunt for Jenna Zan Arbor and Granta Omega, an obsession that has driven the Jedi across systems, is abruptly cut short when Obi-Wan and his team are recalled to Coruscant by Chancellor Palpatine. Not because the situation is under control, but because something far more fragile than a criminal conspiracy is at risk. The Jedi standing within the Republic. On Coruscant, it becomes clear that the anti-Jedi sentiment has been carefully cultivated within the Senate. Whispers of overreach, unelected authority, and accountability is beginning to circulate. Familiar arguments, delivered with just enough concern, sound reasonable. At the center of the movement is Bog Divinand, a minor official with major resentment, acting on behalf of Senator Sano Saru. Together, they believe the Republic's problems stem not from corruption or fear, but from the Jedi themselves. Their solution is bold, reckless, and deeply short-sighted. Remove Palpatine in a political coup, reframe the Jedi as complicit failures, and step into power under the banner of reform. To ensure success, they quietly enlist the aid of Jenna Zan Arbor and Granta Omega, because if you're going to destabilize the Republic, you might as well involve the people who already enjoy doing that for sport. The threat escalates quickly. What began as political maneuvering turns into deadly and direct attacks on the Senate themselves, carried out by seeker droids released at the heart of the galactic government. Obi-Wan, Anakin, Siri, and Ferus are forced into action, not as warriors on a battlefield, but as guardians scrambling to prevent catastrophe in crowded halls and public spaces. It's fast, tense, and chaotic, and while the immediate danger is neutralized, the victory is incomplete. Zan Arbor and Omega escape yet again. And then Palpatine responds. Rather than punishing Senator Saru for his role in the conspiracy, Palpatine does something far more effective. He promotes him to Deputy Chancellor. The move disarms Saru politically, strips him of plausible opposition, and places him directly under Palpatine's watchful eye. It's bloodless, it's elegant, and it works. Anakin Skywalker is watching this unfold, and he's impressed. This is where the thematic core of the story truly settles in. The book isn't just about a failed coup or another narrow escape. It's about power and the many ways it can be exercised. The Jedi rely on restraint, transparency, and trust in institutions that are no longer stable. Palpatine relies on decisiveness, perception, and control. One approach is noble, the other is effective. The tone throughout is tense and political, with an undercurrent of inevitability. There's no grand triumph here, no disasters avoided, and lessons learned by the wrong person. The Republic survives the day, but the damage is done quietly, almost politely. The Jedi maintain order, but lose influence. Anakin takes one more step toward leaving that doing the right thing matters less than doing what works. By the end, the Jedi help Astri Odo and her son Lune disappear into safety, an act of compassion and a story increasingly defined by calculation. It's a small kindness offered in a galaxy that is rapidly forgetting how to value such things. In true prequel fashion, the story closes not with hope, but with calm. The kind of calm that exists just before everything breaks. The story may appear on the surface to be a contained political crisis. A failed coup, a few rogue scientists, and a narrowly avoided catastrophe on Coruscant. But in the wider context of the galaxy, it functions as something much more important, a rehearsal. The rising anti-Jedi sentiment we see here is not an anomaly. It's an early echo of the rhetoric that will later justify everything from the militarization of the Republic to the eventual eradication of the Jedi Order itself. The arguments aren't unfamiliar. Lack of oversight, unchecked authority, emotional detachment. The frightening thing is that none of them are entirely untrue. The Jedi don't lose the galaxy overnight. They lose it slowly, one reasonable sounding criticism at a time. Palpatine's handling of Senator Sorrow is another crucial connective thread. Promoting a conspirator rather than punishing him isn't just clever politics. It's a preview of how Palpatine will consolidate power throughout the Clone Wars. Enemies aren't destroyed, they're absorbed. Opposition isn't crushed, it's reframed. By the time emergency powers are introduced years later, the galaxy will already be accustomed to how Palpatines solve problems by quietly expanding his reach. For Anakin Skywalker, this episode is yet another step along a very familiar path. His admiration for Palpatine's decisiveness mirrors moments we'll later see in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, where Anakin repeatedly equates speed and certainty with moral clarity. This book doesn't turn Anakin, it trains him. It shows him a model of leadership that gets results, even if those results come at the expense of transparency or trust. The Jedi, meanwhile, are locked into a role that grows increasingly untenable. Obi-Wan's careful navigation of politics, Ferus's quiet observation, and Siri's disciplined restraint all highlight a fundamental problem. The Jedi are trying to preserve peace in a system that no longer wants that kind of peace. This tension feeds directly into the Jedi Council's later missteps. Hesitation, compromise, and over reliance on Palpatine himself. Even Jin Arbor and Granta Omega fit into the wider problem. They're not Sith, but they don't need to be. They represent the kind of chaos that thrives in transitional eras. Figures who exploit instability and vanish before consequences arrive. Their repeated escapes reinforce a galaxy where accountability is becoming increasingly optional, especially for those clever enough to stay useful. Viewed in the larger context of the Star Wars timeline, the story is less about stopping an attack and more about normalizing a way of thinking. That the Republic is fragile, that fear justifies control, and that maybe, just maybe, the Jedi aren't the answer anymore. Which, as we all know, is precisely the conclusion someone has been hoping the galaxy would reach. This book doesn't end with a victory so much as a postponement. The Republic survives, the Senate still stands, the Jedi stop the immediate threat, and yet nothing truly feels resolved. That more than anything is what makes the story linger. As the 9th entry in a 10-book series, this installment understands exactly where it sits. It isn't interested in spectacle, it's interested in pressure. The kind that builds quietly, behind closed doors, while everyone insists things are under control. There's no sweeping revelations here, only confirmations of fears the Jedi have been politely ignoring. What makes the story especially effective is how small and plausible its conflict feels. A resentful bureaucrat, an ambitious senator, a public that's grown weary of those claiming to act in its best interest. These aren't galactic supervillains. They're symptoms. And the Jedi, for all their wisdom, are treating symptoms while ignoring the disease. Palpatine's presence looms large. Even when he isn't center stage, his response to the crisis is calm, rational, and undeniably effective. Watching Anakin absorb that lesson, watching him admire the clarity and decisiveness on display, is quietly devastating. There's no lightning, no threats, just a man showing a young Jedi how power should work. And then there's Obi-Wan Kenobi doing what he always does, holding the line, choosing restraint, trusting in systems that are already eroding. He's not wrong, but he's also increasingly outmatched by a galaxy that no longer values patience as a virtue. For me, this story stands out as one of my personal favorites in the series. Not because of its action, but because of its honesty. It doesn't pretend the fall of the Republic was sudden or accidental. It shows how easily fear, frustration, and good intentions can be redirected, especially when someone competent is there to guide it. By the time the book closes, the Jedi have saved a family, prevented a disaster, and upheld their ideals, and yet the future feels more uncertain than ever. And that brings us to the end of this chapter of the Skywalker Files from a certain point of view. What begins as a pause in the hunt for Jenna Zan Arbor and Granta Omega becomes something far more revealing. A reminder that the Republic isn't undone by dramatic gestures, but quiet decisions made in comfortable rooms. The Jedi do their duty, lives are saved, and somewhere along the way, Anakin learns a lesson he was never meant to learn from a person most eager to teach it. If this episode feels less like an ending and more like a deep breath before the plunge, that's because it is. We're now standing on the edge of the series, where the long-running threads finally tighten and there's very little room left to maneuver. The choices made here don't fade, they echo. Next time on the Skywalker Files, we'll be closing out this 10-book journey with the final installment. It's a story about consequences, about lessons fully learned, and about the moment when an uneasy balance between Jedi ideals and galactic reality can no longer hold. The end is approaching, the calm is deceptive, and from a certain point of view, it was always going to end this way. Until then, I'm Rockwell, and thank you for listening to the Skywalker Files.